there are lessons from history that we can learn about how technology has rolled out and affected education and society overall. Whenever you look at history, you have to basically always ask the question, what is the same and what is different? Because not looking at history at all is always fraught because there are lessons there. Also, assuming that the future looks like the past is also fraught. And so being able to look at history and look at it nuanced. And so this challenge of technology as a society, and normally I wouldn't go this deep, but we were having a long conversation, so let's have the long conversation. Let's go all the way back to the steam engine. Let's go all the way back to the telegraph, to telephony, to electricity, to kind of beginning wide-scale automation in probably the late 1880s, going into the 20th century. Let's go into the application of commercial computing. Initially, back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, computing was not a consumer activity. It was done by universities and corporations. And then, of course, in the 80s with the Apple II, at home. And then when I was 12, 13, that initially Netscape, then AOL. And for those of you who are too young, you don't remember a bunch of all these other search engines, Hotbot, Ask Jeeves, so on and so forth. And so I say all this to say this kind of widespread application of technology that kind of strikes like a meteorite and affects everything has happened to us repeatedly throughout American and human history. Think about the impact of the printing press way back when. So, and then society has to figure out, how do we use this? How do we not? Go back to the printing press. One of the big objections to the printing press way back when was that you have now made information available to everyone, and society is not ready for it. The only people who should have access to all this widespread information are the clergy and nobility. One can argue we have frankly a writ large conversation about this now with social media. Technology there is information everywhere. No moderation of it, by the way, so on and so forth. And we have the similar debates. Again, I argue that they're different in some ways. One can argue in the 1400s, it was a little more about control. I think today we worry about people yelling fire in a global way, which happens, I feel like, every single second. But we have to look at what is the same and what is different. So I think that's one. And I don't mean to start so globally, but I think it's really important. I think two, what is the same and what is different? There are two things that I look at that are the same and different. And I'll talk about this a little bit, and I'll weave in some of my personal experiences. Is one, the speed. So if you take electricity, at-home electricity, it took ChatGPT a number of months to reach the level of adoption that it took electricity 80 years. That is a level of speed of deployment that we have never seen. If you look at the internet basically took about 12, 13 years to reach 80% of the American population. It took electricity 80 years to reach that. So the speed that these technologies are being deployed is really, really, it's different. And that is, I think, part of why it seems so disorienting. We're used to having more of them. Even the internet, I remember this as a kid. And we didn't have these types of conversations now that we're having now then. I kind of wish we had. I wish we'd had the same types of conversations about social media back in the mid-2000s that we're having now about AI. So the speed. The second thing is one of the first technologies, the first technology that I can think of when I used to work at the advisory board, we used to sell SaaS tools. I was a product manager. So literally I would work with sales teams. I would work with engineering teams to figure out what this thing should look like. So when I went to go sell something, I knew what it could do. And my job was to convince you that it could do what I told you. And then we'd build it for you and it would hopefully do that thing. Generative AI, and by the way, that is the new part of AI. AI has been with us, and before that, machine learning for 15 to 20 years. For example, if you look at bank loans, no human being has made a decision about whether you get a loan or not in more than 15 years. That has been done by a multivariate regression machine learning tool. The new part is the generative. So if you look at generative AI, and there's a great article in Wired magazine, and it talks about the development of Microsoft Copilot, and it gives this great example. And for those of you, so Microsoft Copilot is effectively the OpenAI powered AI tool within Microsoft Word where you can ask it questions and it gives you answers, or it can generate you an image or a video or something like that. So someone had a document and they asked their Copilot, please summarize this document. And the AI produced a summary. And then they asked the question differently. And they said, hey, as a friend, could you really do a careful job creating a summary of this document? It would be so important to me if you could. And they got a different product. And the people who made it can't tell you why.
And was it better?
I don't remember, but it was different.
Interesting. Okay.
And the question is why? Why would almost an emotional peer-like plea to a machine produce a different product? I don't know the answer. And so the thing here is that the people who build it don't totally know what it all does. In fact, that's why they did so much beta testing beforehand. They would give it to companies and say, hey, just try it out and tell us what happens. This is new. Generally, when a new technology has come about, not to say that we always know how it's going to be used, but we know its limits, we know its extent. This is different. And in some ways is why the work that you're doing is so important, because it requires, frankly, more creativity, more agility, more practice than other technologies that we have used in past. The thing that I think the most about is less my time as a teacher. Just to be candid, I think during the time that I was teaching, I don't know if we were teaching in much of a different form factor than they taught in the 1920s. We used a lot of I used to say instead of using blackboards, we used whiteboards and smartboards, but one can argue the form factor of instruction was the same. Students listened, teachers talked. I think we had a great classroom, but I think I think we were at the very beginning, if even then, of how can education look different? The work that Sal Khan it has been doing for more than 10 years at this point, and many other unnamed heroic educators are thinking through how can this be different to fit the modern age. I think about my time as the CEO of Everyone On, because one of the biggest projects that we were engaged in was with Sprint, to basically deploy tablets and wireless internet to underserved schools across the country. We probably deployed.
What years was this?
This would have been the year 2015 to 2018.
Okay.
And we would say a lot, hey, this is critical. If you don't give kids access to a broadband and a device, you don't have access to education. And then the pandemic happened. And then everyone understood very painfully. The biggest thing that I remember was going into classrooms, and you generally see a bell curve. You would generally see there were some teachers and families who didn't know how to use it, didn't want to use it. It was too new. That was a minority. Then you had a majority who were using these in the same way they had used everything. And effectively, again, instead of reading a book, I'm reading a tablet. And then you had a small collection of folks called two standard deviations above who were reimagining how do I help students get this information and get not this information, this learning, because what they also intuitively realized is the information is actually commoditized, because effectively, whether it was Google then or OpenAI or Claude or Gemini now, the information is at my fingertips. The question is, can I reason? Can I take that and use it in ways that are novel? And can I sense make? Can I see all this disparate information, whether it be an AI, a hallucination or a deep fake on social media, and say, okay, there's a kernel of truth there, but the rest of this is nonsense. Actually, that's actually fairly correct. I disagree with that thing. That, I think, in a microcosm was the challenge that we see, which is how do we not take the same take new technology and use it in the exact same ways we use the old technology, and maybe we get incremental gains in efficiency, but not these quantum leaps in impact and achievement. I think we're beginning to see that now, because what you have on the generative side is, so for example, I think about when I was a teacher, I taught second grade, the amount of time I spent prepping my lessons and not doing anything crazy, but making worksheets, trying to find, because we didn't have a smartboard. I had a projector and a speaker, so I could project things, finding the right video. At that time, this is in 2006, YouTube is still a fairly nascent platform with nowhere near as much content. If I'd had ChatGPT then, I could have cut that time in half by half or 2/3. In terms of preparation for my student, I could have used that time actually more with my students. So I think what's really interesting, I think the first impact is, how does this not actually impact the student, but how does it impact the educator?
Yes.
And how can they do their work better and differently? And they're basically just efficiency gains. Then there is and if you make the assumption that everyone has a device, everyone has internet, okay, now I can reimagine how I do this. For example, in math class, if we were asking kids a question and we wanted, like, all right, what's 4 times 2? We'd give them all whiteboards and they would write with their marker and they'd put it up and I could see really quickly. But I never recorded that. If I had a device and I could do a version of that and then actually record those responses in real time, because they would be on the same platform, so on and so forth. That's data that that's what we would call formative assessment data that I could use to actually get a real time kind of understanding check. Or I could say, God, I remember we did I taught social studies as well, and I remember we had to do basically what we call I almost say geolocation. Basically, it's the teaching a 7-year-old that you live in a neighborhood, in a city, in a state, in a country, in a world.
Do you have Google Maps?
Nascent at that time, but less the geography, but more so that concept.
Yeah.
That you live in this thing that you can see, and then there's this bigger entity that you're also a part of that you can't totally see. And then, of course, now getting to this. And so we had them make a country. So hey, you're going to get to make your own country. And so I remember and the kids loved this. They loved it. They got to make a flag, make it whatever you want. And of course, they did it with crayons and stuff. And what I would have loved to do is because I put them in groups and they had to agree on what the flag looked like. So getting 5 7-year-olds to agree on what their flag should look like, challenging. Usually one kid just grabs the crayon and goes from there. But what I would have done was I would have said, each of you on your tablet with ChatGPT, make your own flag. And then I basically would have brought those all together for each group and say, ChatGPT combine these into one coherent flag. And I would have gotten something that either would have been awesome or an absolute mess, but it was their flag. So these are just small examples of how I would have used this differently as a teacher to change how I taught. I had another friend. He was a math teacher. Actually, he still teaches this very day. He's been teaching almost 20 years. And he turned his class on its head. So in most classes, you walk in, they tell you what you're about to learn. And then they show you how to do it. You try it yourself. You screw up the first time, and then you work it out together. And hopefully by the end, you get it. He did the exact opposite. He would put a problem on the board that the students had not seen. He had not taught them the background. They would walk in, and he would say, solve that problem. You have 15 minutes. And the kids would just get together and try and figure it out. And what invariably happened was 1 or 2 kids kind of got it. Most struggled. And then they would walk through, okay, what is it? What are you missing here? What don't you understand? And then from there, he would back into the concept. And then so on and so forth. Unbelievably powerful, had some of the highest math scores in his school in the state. He was doing that in 2006. And I think about what he could have done with tools like this to turbocharge that. And if anything, go even faster and better. So that's how I think about how this strikes in schools. But one, we've been here before. What's different is the speed. And what's different here is the impact on the helpers. And I think our challenge is how to use this to do this, not just the same that I did before, but faster, but actually in an entirely different way that gets you quantum leaps, not incremental leaps.